for survivors of church sexual abuse. And that research focus has seen her collaborate in a number of projects with Professor David Toombs, who is the director of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues and Professor of Public Theology here at the University of Otago. David and Rocío will be presenting this evening some of the findings from Rocío's interviews with 6 former nuns of the Servants of God's Planned Community in Peru, in Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador. David and Rocío will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity for questions and discussion through to 8 p.m. when we'll wrap things up for the evening. I'll explain just before we begin the question and discussion time how that part of the evening will work. Now, just a reminder, this is, of course, a very sensitive subject, and so I ask all participants tonight to be respectful and sensitive in your comments and questions, being attentive especially to the fact that some participants who may have experienced abuse, the subject of our conversation tonight, will be especially raw and painful. So please engage respectfully and carefully with your questions and discussions later on. As Rocío and David offer their presentations, please keep yourself muted, and then in question time, you can unmute yourself when you're asking a question or making a comment. As I say, we'll explain more about that later. But without any further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to Professor David Toombs to begin with, who will start our presentation this evening.
Thanks, Murray, and thanks to everyone for joining us for what Murray has rightly said is a challenging but important topic. Just bear with me 1 second while I pull up the slides for the first part. Our presentation this evening is going to be in 2 parts. First, I'll give a brief introduction to spiritual abuse and what we mean by it in this presentation. Then the main part of this evening will be based on interviews conducted by Rocío with 6 former members of the Servants of the Plan of God community. After that, there'll be time for Q&A. Before I start, just to give a quick content warning, as you'll have gathered from the title and from Murray's remarks, we will be talking about spiritual abuse. We don't expect to be talking about anything very graphic, but some of the experiences and feelings are powerful and might touch on confronting and sensitive areas. So please do take care of yourself as you listen and feel welcome to take a break if you wish to. So first up, we're going to look at what is meant by spiritual abuse, then the findings from interviews with 6 former members. Let's dive into it. The concept of spiritual abuse is attracting significant attention at present, and we think it's a helpful and useful concept, but we also recognise it has its critics. Writing on spiritual abuse goes back over 30 years, and the definition and the conceptual understanding that goes with the definition has progressed a great deal over that time. An early definition and the pioneering work of David Johnson and Jeff Van Vonderen is spiritual abuse is the mistreatment of a person who is in need of help, support, or greater spiritual empowerment, with the result of weakening or undermining or decreasing that person's spiritual empowerment. That was from 1991. Diane Langberg, a highly respected Christian psychologist in the US, who is known for her work on abuse in faith communities and her advocacy for survivors, gives a really helpful and short statement. She says, spiritual abuse involves using the sacred to harm or deceive the soul of another. Doris Reisinger, who's a former nun, and who is therefore particularly relevant to this discussion because she experienced abuse during her time in a religious community in Germany, offers a definition that foregrounds the perspective of the one who suffers the abuse. She speaks of spiritual abuse as a violation of a person's spiritual freedom. Damaris Ware points out that spiritual abuse must be addressed in relation to the dynamics of power. Spiritual abuse, he says, happens in a spiritual context, and it involves a misuse of social power. Status and authority, for example, because of one's position at the top of a hierarchy. Or, for example, when a religious leader uses God or their special relationship with God to control people's behaviour. The UK scholar Lisa Oakley offers one of the most nuanced and helpful definitions of spiritual abuse, drawn from interviews she did in 2017. She says, spiritual abuse is a form of emotional and psychological abuse. It is characterized by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior in a religious context. Her work is particularly useful because it offers features that help us to recognize abuse. She writes, this abuse may include manipulation and exploitation, enforcing accountability, censorship of decision-making, requirements for secrecy and silence, coercion to conform, control through the use of sacred texts or teaching, the requirement of obedience to the abuser, the suggestion that the abuser has a divine position, isolation as a means of punishment, and superiority and elitism. This definition, I think, is particularly helpful, the Oakley definition, for thinking about spiritual abuse as not just one-time instances and individual actions, but in terms of systems and patterns. There's also a good overview of definitions by Samuel Fernandez, who summarizes, in summary, 3 features of spiritual abuse are highly apparent in these definitions: the misuse of spiritual power, the harm that it causes to victims, and a benefit that the abusers seek for themselves. Now, trying to draw some of these insights together, in our work, we use the following definition. Spiritual abuse, we say, occurs when churches or agents use religious symbols, texts, teachings, prayers, or their leadership to violate or threaten the spiritual self, freedom, and experience and relationship with God. One final area before I pass over to Rocío is to say a little bit about why this topic matters. It's challenging, but it is important. It does matter. Understanding it helps make a difference to people's lives. First, that's because spiritual abuse is a problem in its own right. As you'll hear from Rocío, spiritual abuse has very negative impact for individuals and for the community. It has toxic and corrosive consequences, which are the opposite of what God wants for God's people. Second, spiritual abuse enables other forms of abuse. Our main focus this evening is on spiritual abuse as abusive in its own right. But Rocío will also speak a bit on reports of emotional and psychological abuse alongside spiritual abuse, and the ways that spiritual abuse can enable and sustain other forms of abuse. We won't be speaking about sexual abuse, but this is an area we have worked on in recent years, and it's an area which we both think's important. With that as introduction, at this point, Rocío, I'll pass over to you, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I will now share. Okay. My screen. Are you see my screen? Yes, all good. Thank you, Mirai, for the introduction, and David for your presentation. And we continue because, as David told you, we will be talking about the interviews that I did with 6 ex-nuns. But to understand a little bit, I will explain about the community. There were 3 communities you can see here. the community Sodalicio Cristiane Vitae, the Marian Community of Reconciliation, and the Servants of God's Plan. So it's important to understand that the three communities had the same founder. The founder was Luis Fernando Figari. He founded Sodalicio Cristiane Vitae, or Sodalicio, in Lima, Peru. Sodalicio is a society of apostolic life. It's a kind of congregation in the canon law in the Catholic Church. And the majority of the members were or are lay people, lay consecrated people. They have a small number of priests. The word sodalicium is hard to translate, but it's a little bit of a community, brotherhood. But in English, the word doesn't mean much. So we call it sodalicio. So I will be naming it as sodalicio. But so in 1991, so the sodalicio was founded in 71. In 1991, Figari, the same founder, founded a community called Marian Community of Reconciliation, which is the female branch, made up only of lay consecrated women. The mission of Sodalicio and the Marian Community of Reconciliation was to serve young people, serve the poor, and evangelize the culture. I was one of the first people who entered the Marian Community of Reconciliation. I was 15 years old when I entered, and 18 when we began the community. And actually, we were 5 girls, 5 young ladies that began the community. In 1998, Figari founded a third community called Siervas del Plan de Dios, or Servants of God's Plan. And this is a community of nuns who wore the traditional religious habit, and their charism was to serve especially the sick and the poor. I am going to speak about 6 interviews with former members of the Servants of God's Plan, the third foundation. But before I will give you a little bit of background that relates to the other 2 communities, because I think it is important to understand a little bit better. So, as I told you, I belong to the community of Marian Reconciliation. I was a superior of the community. I was 18 years old when I became a superior of 7 young ladies. But I experienced sexual abuse when I was 15 years old by the second in command of the Sodalicio, of the male community. I was abused, but I couldn't label that it was an abuse, because the second in command, through exercises of yoga, convinced me that it will help to master my chastity. Year passed and I went to Rome as a superior of Rome in 1998. And it is just after 20 years that I could recognize that the second in command, the vicar, abused me. He died. And the community, he had a fame of sanctity. We were in that moment, we were more than 10,000 members in total. 10,000 members in total. And he had a fame of sanctity, of holiness. So they wanted to canonize him. So I began silently an internal investigation, because I was doubting if that was real or not. And of course, I discovered more victims. I went to the founder to tell him, and of course, he blamed me. He said that I was lying, that I was the one to blame, that I was doing a complot against Sodalicio, and I was absolutely isolated. And he began telling everybody that I was crazy and that I needed psychiatric help. So from 2006, I began an internal investigation that took me more than 12 years. I discovered in that moment, I was within the community, and I discovered 17 victims from the male community. They were all my friends. The authorities began a campaign against me and asked the community to kick me out. But I decided to stay in that community till I found the truth and how many abusers were and what was the truth about the founder. In 2012, I also found victims from the founder, and it is then when I left the community, when I finally could put all the denounces from the victims to the Vatican and to the tribunal in Lima. In 2010, the Peruvian journalist Pedro Salinas, a former Sodalicio member, accused Figari, the founder, and other leaders of physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. He published a book, very popular, became very, lots of publicity because he interviewed more than 20 former victims, and his book was called Half Monks, Half Soldiers. We contain victims, the testimony of the victims. In response, Sodalicio appointed a special commission interviewing more than 50 of their former and current members. On the 16th of April, 2016, so I began the investigation in 2006, so we are 10 years after, the commission published a 10-page report saying the damage was perpetrated in a situation in which the superiors assumed a dominant position, asking for perfect and absolute obedience achieved by the practice of extreme discipline. This way of exercising power was an attempt to destroy their individual will. As the report of the commission, because it was an independent commission, was so negative, the community decided to refuse the report and to create a new commission, which they paid to new investigators. Of course, the new commission was very benign and used just Figari as a scapegoat to free all the rest of abusers. Figari was sanctioned by the victim by the Vatican in 2017, and he is now barred from having any contact with the communities he founded. Sodalicio recognized 66 victims, set aside a fund of nearly $2 million for reparation. After the publication of the book, because I helped the journalist, and after all the denounces that I helping the victims, living in New Zealand, I felt the calling to help victims and give voice to them. And I met David Toms, and here I met David, and here in New Zealand is when I read his studies, seeing Jesus as a victim of abuse. It touched me profoundly, deeply. And we decided to begin a research. Our first project was about listening to male survivors of Sodalicio, of the male survivors, and reflecting on their psychological and spiritual consequences of abuse. The first project is the one I showed you before, listening to male survivors of charged sexual abuse, and we published it. And it was done at the University of Otago. Now we decided to do these interviews because I wanted to give voice to the women there and to examine spiritual abuse in the context of the servants of God's plan. We conducted qualitative research with 6 former members who had raised complaints against the community in Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador. Their pseudonyms are Jessica, Mari Carmen, Gabriela, Rosana, Alejandra, and Rosa. Very Spanish pseudonyms. We identified 4 important issues. In the presentation, we're going to be talking about 4 troubling issues which emerged from the interviews and give you a brief sense of what they each involved. So we'll talk about the perfection and holiness, the absolute obedience, the coercive control, and the secrecy and isolation. Let's begin with perfection, holiness, and God's plan. It's interesting how one of the the participants said, Rosa said, I had to be perfect. She explained, in everyday life, there was an enormous pressure to do things correctly and to achieve perfection. There were rigorous and millimetric demands that generated a huge inner tension in me. I had a very exaggerated fear of the slightest mistake and of being mistreated afterwards. And here is interesting because the servants were called servants of God's plan. No? So they were demanded to accomplish God's plan every day in every millimetric situation. This perfectionism was instilled by an almost military regime. Rosanna said, I was told that if I wanted to serve God, I should be a strong woman. She tells her story and she said, I did not know how to swim. My formators, my religious superiors, would ask me to jump into the pool. And if I held on the edges, they would dislodge my fingers with a stick. When I expressed my concern to another superior, I was told that if I wanted to serve God, I should be a strong woman and never question the formators. Because of this instruction in my head, I let it continue. Jessica also gives her testimony, and she said something interesting, because the interviews reported a lack of spiritual freedom. Jessica was obliged to pray what the authorities asked. She says, they sent us to pray, but they gave us the specific text of the gospel, which they wanted us to meditate on. And they also gave us specific commentaries of the gospels. We never prayed or read anything that we wanted to. We never prayed to other saints, for example. Mother Teresa of Calcutta was forbidden. Alejandra remembers, we would pray at our desks. Alejandra is another of the participants. Some of us had a holy card or a picture of Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus. We were told to remove that saint because she was not from our charism. Mari Carmen mentioned a similar prohibition. I was singing a song to the heart of Jesus. The superior told me that it was too sentimental and I was forbidden to sing the song. This is the first topic that emerged. A second important topic was regarding the absolute obedience that they had to live. Gabriela affirmed, we were told that in the house, the superiors were God. Rosanna affirmed, she says that in 2006, she suffered an accident as a result of obeying an order from her superior. Rosanna said, I did not like to go down some stairs because it was dark. My superior obliged me to go down those stairs to overcome my fear. I fell down and fractured my tibia and fibula. That was the first of 15 surgeries I had in the community. When they asked me how I fell, I said that they forced me down the stairs. The superior corrected me and made me write 100 times that she who obeys is never wrong. She told me that I could not question and that God had allowed the accident. Now Rosanna cannot walk anymore. She lumps and her leg doesn't work. Mari Carmen, regarding also the coercive control, we'll talk about the coercive control now. Mari Carmen says the spiritual abuse was violent. I could not complain about any suffering. You know that we consecrate ourselves to the sufferer. A question of the examination of conscience was, did I show my tiredness to others? They always told us that if we were tired, we should not show it or express it. If the sisters saw me with a grumpy face, they said I was an ass face. They never allowed me to express my emotions. To show that you were tired was a sin. Actually, they were obliged to always smile. And it was true, you always saw them smiling and we didn't get it. And we always asked ourselves, what's going on with them that they are always smiling? Because they seemed that always everything was okay. And it was really a weird situation. Rosa said, the superiors constantly insisted that having doubts was a product of the devil, and any kind of disagreement was against authority. To talk against them was seen as a sin and a betrayal of the community. Another element that emerged is that these ladies were isolated from their family and friends. Rosa affirmed, my formators and superiors were very insistent in this sense. I could not trust anyone else. I could tell my family absolutely nothing about what was happening to me. Several times, my formator listened to my conversations with my family. She asked me to put the call on a speaker. On one occasion, I told my parents that I was ill. And afterwards, my superior told me that I don't have to tell my family about it. These are some of the examples. Now, I was telling David and Marai, it has been published a book from a journalist, Camila Bustamante, with 20 testimonies regarding physical, spiritual, and sexual abuse from this community. So we have done the research of 6 victims, but now we have a book that has been published yesterday with 20 testimonies. And actually today, the journalist was telling me that many more women are speaking up after reading the book. And we have now, we put some questions now. Why is it happening? Why why is spiritual abuse more frequent in female congregations? And it appears that it's more a problem of female congregations, which is a concern raised by the Giovanni Cucci, who is a psychologist in the Catholic Church. But first of all, I think we need to say that religious consecrated life in the Catholic Church is made up by women. Statistics in 2019 show that there were 50,295 male religious, so 50,000 more or less, and 630,000 women religious, which is 12 times as many. And also we have to consider an element that in the case, that also it is important to say that in the case of male congregations many times are not just religious, but also priests. So they have much more autonomy from the community and much more opportunity for self-direction as they live out the religious vows. And the third important element is that women in the Catholic Church there are second citizens. A third factor is a systemic undervaluing of women within the church. Women are insufficiently involved in the decision-making processes of the church. So it's much easier to be more vulnerable to abuse because they are already in a feeling, having kind of devaluation of themselves as participants in the church. The notion also, another important element, that the notion of, I think that we need in one way to redefine obedience, in particular in how obedience is lived in the Catholic Church regarding to the vows. The notion of obedience in religious life that has been passed in the tradition of the Catholic Church asks for a total submission of will and reason, in which the authority represents God. I think it is a problematic notion that enables abuse, that does not respect the faculties of the person and makes any authority a sacred person. So I think we need to redefine obedience, because first, superiors are human. The vow of obedience of religious sisters is to obey God and not to obey human beings. Of course, for practical issues, communities need an authority, but we have a distinction in the Catholic canon law, that is the difference between the external forum, which is the life of the community and the apostolic life, and the internal forum, that it means that no one can invade your spiritual life, your conscience, your freedom, your thoughts as a member of the community. I also participated in this project, that is a project launched by Voices of Faith, which is an association of women who wants to empower women within the Catholic Church. And we called it Red Flags in Religious Life. And we tried to explain a little bit about the red flags that young ladies can have when they enter to a community of religious life. So we want to avoid this kind of spiritual abuse regarding the different vows and regarding their lives, their spiritual life. And they are having lots of success. And I think, yep, it's not enough just to help victims of spiritual abuse, but also to prevent it before, with prevention and formation of these young ladies that become really very vulnerable in this kind of situations. So if you are more interested, there are some of our publications. And this is the one in which we interview women, but also this one is the one in which we interview ex-nuns or nuns, but not from this community, but from different communities, regarding what do they think about Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse. And yeah, so I leave it there.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed, Rocío and David, for this presentation. We're going to move into a time of question and discussion now, but I'm going to stop the recording